Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Jack the Lad podcast. On today's episode, we've got Shane Rogers. He is a full-time podcaster and stand-up comedian. He's had, a very sort of strange life in the circus. And, I'd like you all to give him a warm welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. This is cool. I've been listening, so I really enjoy your interview style, and I'm excited to be here.
Well, thank you very much. I've had a couple of guests mention like how I am, with it. I had a psychologist professor on. That was quite early on, actually, and I did some, like you were saying, before we went live. We were obviously live, but and I did some digging about social psychologists, papers and stuff like that, and I asked him a couple of questions on it, and he said, I've been on loads of podcasts. He said no one's ever asked me about that side of it. And it sort of caught him off guard a little bit, and he was like, because I pronounced something wrong, I think, it was a lettery word, shall we say. And I pronounced it slightly wrong, and he corrected me, and he was like, oh, right, went into it, and I was like, that's crazy. So thanks for that.
Yeah, for sure. Interviewing is definitely an art form. It's one that I have not mastered yet, so I have a lot of respect for people who do. It takes, you have to really draw something out of people and keep it flowing, and that can be difficult. I do a podcast with another comedian, and we've known each other for years, since, before college. So for us, I think it's easier just because we have that dynamic. But with interviewing, I mean, you're talking to a stranger, and that's weird. It's hard to kind of fake that chemistry. And so some people just have the natural ability to sort of make that chemistry happen right away. And I'm always impressed by that.
Yeah, I like to think I'm a friendly person, and I'm very easy to speak to. I mean, I'm very opinionated.
The problem is I'm just not I'm not a friendly person. that's my issue. I have to fake it every time. I'm a mistake.
It's so strange because yes, I'm like with yourself and other guests a lot. I'm really friendly and all the rest of it, but because I'm so dedicated to this podcast at the minute, I don't see many people. I literally like to, my kids and stuff like that. But other than that, it's just like I'm like a hermit.
That's what podcasting does to you.
Yeah, I am a very friendly person, and I like to think I get on with most people. I've got very strong opinions on a lot of things, but in my head they're normally down the middle, and they're pretty well thought out, and they stick with the facts usually, to be honest. But I love doing this podcast, and I've learned so much from so many people, and it's an absolute honour to have someone that does it full time. Like that's the goal for me.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, it was the goal for us. Actually, it wasn't the goal for us starting out. Our podcast is Midnight Facts for Insomniacs, and me and Duncan, the other comedian, we started it. You and I talked about this just a little bit before we started recording, that we started it kind of not as a joke, but just we weren't taking it seriously. We started by recording in my car. We had a little handheld recorder, and we were recording us talking about stuff, and we were not taking it seriously. We didn't know where it was going to go. And but now it has become something that we really do take seriously, and also put a lot of energy and a lot of, like you said, it becomes all encompassing. Podcasting can take over your life, and we were really lucky that it happened right during COVID, because comedy ended and there was no other outlet, so it became our outlet, and it still remains our outlet. I'm going back to doing comedy now, but I'm definitely not going to ever quit the podcast. I love doing a podcast, and like you said, it becomes a really integral part of your life, and a great way to express yourself. It's a great outlet.
Yeah, definitely. And like I said, the people I've met and that I would never have got to speak to in normal day-to-day life, and the in-depth conversations I've had with people, and I've mentioned them in previous podcasts, so I won't, bore the listeners with all that again, but I've learned so much about people that I knew previously for a very, very long time, and I didn't know about it until I got them on here.
Yeah, so, absolutely. I mean, we actually have a lot of it has to do with the fans, I think, for us, because we've created a community. We call our fans the Insomniacs, and they're all people who obviously, if they're listening to us, they have something in common with us. And I think because we have this sort of chemistry and we've known each other for so long, there's a very much it's a very welcoming environment. It feels like, we've had people describe it as it feels like they're kind of sitting with us and chatting and joking around, and that has become, a lot of those people have become friends. I mean, we have people in our Discord community. We've got about 400 people in there, always kind of hanging out and talking and voting on topics and discussing the episodes. And they've become real friends. One of the moderators for our Discord, recently, she was having some health problems, and like a bunch of us sent her a bunch of stuffed animals and things, and a bunch of the Insomniacs. One of the Insomniacs drove to her house to deliver them, and it was just, she lives in Kentucky, which, if you know anything about America, is really far from California, where I live. So these are people that I never would have connected with or met, and yet because the podcast drew them in, and they're going to have things in common with us because they like the things we say and the way that we communicate. You just find your community, you find your people, and that's just been a huge for us. I mean, it's been really, really heartwarming in a lot of ways. It sounds cheesy to say that, but also just really rewarding for us.
Yeah, definitely. And like you said then about, interacting with people that you don't know. For you, it is both ways, but obviously I can see on my Buzzsprout feed and all the rest of it about who's listening in what countries and all the rest of it. And yeah, I'm quite surprised at some of the places that I've managed to reach.
Right.
Like I've got a listener in Nicaragua, and
Yeah.
I've never been there. I know where it is because it's on the it's on the lines for the drug runs.
Right.
So I know where that is. But
It's their claim to fame. Yeah.
but I don't know anyone there, and it's it's the same town. And it's with 25 episodes that are live now. I've got a few, like I said earlier, in the bank, but and 25 listens, and it's all in the same place. So yeah, it's
Yeah, similar for us. I mean,
days.
it's been very cool. We are 50% of our listeners actually, or 50% of our downloads are outside of America. So we're about half the states, and then in order, I think it's the UK, Australia, and Canada. Or no, UK, Canada, Australia. But then there's all these, we have listeners in Germany, we have listeners in Holland, we have listeners in random little countries that I've never even heard of, which is very cool. And, I always kind of wonder, a couple of them have popped in to the Discord every now and then, and I get to sort of find out how they found it, how they sort of connected with it, what's appealing about it to them. And that's been really cool. So yeah, it's expanding horizons too. I mean, just like you said, like there's no way that I would have connected with someone in, Uganda if not for this podcast.
Yeah, definitely, and that's the same for me with my guests as well. Like, I've spoke to a lad in Singapore a couple of episodes ago, and then I've had a few American people on and stuff like that, and I've learned a lot about your that side of the pond, compared to sort of the UK, like the laws and stuff, and how the crime rates and all that sort of stuff. It's been quite interesting, to be honest, and like stuff that was sort of a side, like a just an add-on, an annex of what we were actually talking about. That was just like a side note of sort of day-to-day life in America. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, same for us. We actually, so my co-host is, his mother's British, and so he's technically, I guess, has dual citizenship. So he knows a lot about England. He's been to the UK. I've only been to England, Scotland, and Wales one time. I just went and did like a little circuit. But he's been there a lot and knows a lot. And so I felt like I needed to kind of, and we have so many listeners there. I mean, we have a large contingent of listeners in the UK. And so I felt like I sort of needed to immerse myself more in British culture. And so my wife and I started watching Love Island from like the beginning. And we just kind of scrolled back to like the first season. And I'm just now using all this like British slang in our Discord because we have a lot of Brits in the Discord. And, I didn't know what a scouser was. Like now I know some scouser lingo. I know, from Liverpool, like I can't even understand.
Scouser.
Yeah, we'll put on the captions because a lot of times with the show, I can't understand what they're saying, and I'll be rewinding to try to figure out. And, I didn't know now I know a lot of the lingo. I know, I don't want to be a minger or a hanger, or, I know to get my graft on. Like I'm just learning all kinds of stuff, all the worst possible stuff, I'm sure.
Yeah, I was gonna say I haven't heard a couple of them, to be honest. So Yeah, I don't watch Love Island. I never have watched it. I didn't even know what it was about until yesterday when someone explained it to me. I had no idea. And I was like, and people watch that? And she was like, yeah, loads of people. And I was like, why?
Oh, no, save yourself. Don't watch it.
It doesn't appeal to me in the slightest. I was like, what? And people sit and watch that, but how long's it on for? And she was like, well, like an hour a night. And I was like, but I've got better things to do than sit there for an hour and watch that.
And there are so many episodes. I mean, I think there's like 50 episodes a season or something. Like it's insane.
But people don't see that this is what's sucking their time.
Oh yeah.
When I say to people because when I'm doing my HGV driving, I talk to like the warehouse staff of each store. Shout out Matt Alan, that's who I work for. It's quite a big clothing company in the UK. When I go to the back doors, I speak to every single one of them, and I always ask them. I ask them how long they've been at Matalan and what was their dream job. Because obviously, no one dreamed to work at Matalan. No one unless other than the owner of Matalan. And I'm not shitting on Matalan; it's a good company to work for, but no one planned to end up working there. And and some of them have said, "Oh, I wanted to do this, I wanted to do that, and all the rest of it." Some of them have been outrageous, and you're like, "Well, that was probably never achievable." But I was speaking to one girl, and she said, "Oh, I want to, I'd really like to be a paramedic." And I was like, "That's achievable. You can, that's not a high skill job that you need, every qualification in the world or anything." So I was like, "Why don't you do that?" And so I spoke to her about some bits that I sort of knew about first responders and stuff, where you can volunteer to start with, but that's your sort of foot in the door to get to it. And she was like, "Oh, I'll look into it." And I didn't think anything of it. And I came back to that store about 3 months later, and I said, "Oh, it was the same girl on then again." It usually is the same people I see. And I said, "Oh, have you done anything about your thingy?" She was, "Oh, thank you very much." It's like, yeah, I went up, I found out about about volunteering and stuff, and that I do that now. I go once a week, and at the minute I'm just getting trained up. But yeah, wow. That's the last thing. And I was like, "Oh, that's amazing! Like, that's wicked, cool. Well done." So just chatting with people like that and having a different outlook on life now, because I'm so dedicated to this podcast, is I'm just like, you lot waste so much time. Like I get back from work, I immediately go out for a run. It's the first, just work kit off, running kit on, straight out, get it done. I'm trying to do, I'm doing 35k a week, which obviously is 5k a day, but because when I have the kids and stuff like that, I can't cram it in because I'm single. So when I have my kids, obviously I have to look after them. I can't just go for a run or whatever. I smashed, I work it out, and so I need to do 7 kilometers today, whatever, to hit my 35. I've been doing it for the last 2 weeks. It's really good. It's been pretty brutal, to be honest, because I'm quite a heavy. I think I'm about 15 stone now, maybe 15 and a half. But I've just done a triathlon. So I'm now banging that in as well. And but other than that, once I've done the run, I'm back in here, then podcasting. And I don't have the time to watch TV.
That's good. Well, that's a good problem to have. I mean, it's good when you don't even have time to waste on something that's just going to rot your mind. And it will totally rot your mind. Don't bother with reality TV is the worst. And this is the worst of the reality TV, but it does have a sense of humor about itself. That is the one thing I like about Love Island and British reality TV. It seems to be that seems to be a theme with the UK, where they sort of know, I think because you have all this celebrity culture and all of your tabloid newspapers and stuff, there's a tongue-in-cheek aspect to a lot of it. It's very self-referential, and they make fun of, there's a voiceover guy who's, I believe, Scottish, and he just makes fun of the people the entire time, like how vain they are, and there are some redeeming qualities, I think, with it, but overall, just reality TV is terrible. I do think it's important. One of the things that I need to do is kind of wind down, because I'm very go a lot of the time, and like you, I do a jog every day, I work out every other day. I'm very focused on things, and I dive in with both feet, and I need to turn my brain off at certain times and just be able to disconnect. And that's how we do it. We watch Love Island is what we watch to go to sleep. So when we go lay down, we turn it on and we just kind of cuddle and watch TV until we fall asleep. And I'll usually turn it off right before we crash. But it's a great way to kind of just let your mind relax, because you don't have to do any work. When you're watching a show like that, your brain is not engaged. You know, you can watch it
Yeah, yeah,
passively. And I feel
yeah.
like I don't do a lot of things passively in my life. Even the podcast. I mean, one of the things, so our podcast is it's a weekly, every week our fans in the Discord, they vote on the next topic. So they suggest the topics and then they choose the topic. And so every week I have a deep dive that I have to do into some new subject. We just did astrology, which I didn't know anything about, the history of astrology and how it all works, and the houses and moons and suns rising. And I mean, it's very intricate. Before that, we did like gladiators. We did one on like QAnon. So I'm always doing these really deep dives, and my brain is kind of always working on the podcast in some way, and or comedy, writing comedy. And so I do think it's important to be able to like find a way to just to wind down. And so those things can be useful, but ultimately, yeah, they're just rotting. I'm sure they're rotting the back of my mind. I'm becoming a worse person every day by watching Love Island.
Yeah, it sounds like it. You mentioned there obviously about your astrology and gladiators, and that. And what's been the standout thing that you've learned that you were like, that you absolutely didn't think they did or that had happened that you weren't aware of?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, in this last episode, the most recent one is on gladiators. And I didn't know, I just thought that they fought to the death all the time, that it was this like really brutal, fatal. Like if you were a gladiator, you were either going to kill or be killed. And it wasn't like that. It was like National Geographic says, and this is somewhat disputed, but about 90% of gladiators survived a fight. So most of the time, it was just a fight to basically the victory until the other person was unable to fight or gave up. And then, they had there was this idea that the emperor or the sponsor of the games would then get to determine whether the person died with like a thumbs up or thumbs down, which is not true. The thumbs up was most likely the sign to actually kill the person because it was like a go ahead, like, yeah, go ahead and kill him. And then a closed fist would have been the sign to spare them. But most of the time they were spared because gladiators were expensive. They were slaves most of the time. And so they were property, and training them and feeding them and housing them was very expensive. So you didn't just want to go throwing them out to the wolves, so to speak, and going through a ton of gladiators because you were going to spend a lot of money. So for the most part, gladiator bouts were actually fairly civilized affairs in comparison to what we think they were. Also, they didn't fight multiple people at once. We always see them like fighting, a lion and three other gladiators and one guy's. They never did that. It was always a one-on-one thing. Sometimes they would have pairs of gladiators, multiple pairs in the Colosseum or in the arena, but they would always be fighting their counterpart, and it was supposed to be a fair fight. So only certain types of gladiators would fight certain types of gladiators. You wouldn't have the guy with the trident and the net, which was a real thing, but you wouldn't have them fighting like a Murmillo with just a sword and shield. You would have them fighting another guy with a trident and a net. So there were a lot of things that I just assumed that Hollywood had not lied to me, but it turns out there were a lot of things I didn't know.
Yeah, I was going to say, my sort of thought on gladiators would be that they would put them pairing together to see which one was the better, offense and defense
It makes sense
in the arena. Or someone comes in and goes, I'll beat anyone with a sword and shield. And then, everyone's like, well, we'll put him against him and him against him and keep doing it until we find something that can beat him.
The problem was that, I mean, they had gladiators, for instance, who fought blindfolded. There was a whole class of gladiators who fought each other blindfolded. I think they were called the andabata. I might have that word wrong, but it's pretty close. And you just, if you throw in one of those guys with a guy on horseback, which they did, they had gladiators on horseback as well, it's going to be a pretty short fight, and it's not going to be super exciting when a guy on horseback is mowing down some guy who can't even see. So they really wanted the fights that took place before, or not even fights, but the exhibitions that took place before the gladiatorial matches. So they would have beast shows, and they would have reenactments of these classic battles, right? And they would throw convicts in there. So they would have, it was a way of basically getting rid of undesirables in an entertaining way. They would throw these people who had been convicted of, stealing or whatever it was, and they would just have them slaughter each other. So that was where most of the murder took place. And then by the time they got to the gladiator bouts were more just about single combat. Like it was like MMA. It was like, let's see these two guys, and almost in weight classes, right? You don't want to put someone who's just going to slaughter someone in there because it's not going to be fun. It's going to take 2 seconds. So they wanted, two guys, sometimes women. They did actually have female gladiators. They would put them in there, making sure that it would be a good match, that it would last a while, and that there would be some drama to the fight. And so yeah, they did have exhibitions and big shows that were just absolute slaughters and just super bloody and tons of people killed. They would burn people alive in the Colosseum. They would feed them to lions. Those were real things that happened. But when it came to the gladiator bouts, they were almost like a boxing match. It was like, we want to see two strong, talented, trained combatants go at each other, and let's find out who wins.
Yeah, do you think there'll ever be a day that we'll get back to that?
I do. I mean, I don't think we're that far from it. I've seen some MMA matches where people just got their faces destroyed and there's just blood all over the place. I've seen, there's boxing matches where people have died. And I watched The Running Man recently for, I was a guest on a podcast, and we watched The Running Man, which is an old Schwarzenegger movie for anyone who hasn't seen it, about a game show where they hunt convicts down and kill them. And I mean, I honestly think that we're not that far from that. I do think, if you watch like Squid Game or something, it doesn't feel that strange to me, especially like, imagine, right, the amount that we hate pedophiles. Like, pedophiles are the worst. And there's very few people who would object to a game show, I think, where someone like hunted down and killed a pedophile or killed a murderer. Someone, we do in America, in a lot of states, we do put people to death. And doing that publicly, I don't see as being a huge leap. I don't think there would be many people who would argue with it. And with the rise of reality TV and pushing the boundaries, I think it's someday we're going to see like, the pedophile hunt, where they send out 3 guys to go hunt down a pedophile and kill him on TV. I absolutely believe that that's something that we're not too civilized to accept as a society.
Yeah. I mean, I've never really thought about it that much, but Mark Normand has a bit on pedophiles. I don't know if you know about it.
That rings a bell. I think I've probably heard that bit. I've opened for Mark Normand at Rooster T. Feathers in the Bay Area, and I think I do remember some bit about pedophiles.
Yeah, and it's about grape juice, and when he was younger, he liked grape juice. When now he's older, he likes wine, but he also likes grape juice. And he's like, it's the same with pedophiles. Yes, when I was 6, I liked 6-year-olds. Now I'm 36, I now like 36-year-olds, but they still like 6-year-olds. And that's like,
that encapsulates Mark Normand as a bit. Because something that is funny but also horrific.
Because I've never thought of it like that, and then I was like, well, is it? Because it's a mental illness, isn't it? They just thingy, but obviously they do act on it as well, which then obviously it's all sort of a grey area. I'm very much in your corner with that, and I would, as long as it wasn't too expensive, as long as it's sort of UFC prices, then we're in. Do you know what I mean?
I agree with you though that like non-offending pedophiles, that's a different thing. If it's just a mental illness and you're attracted to whatever you're attracted to, and you can't change that.
Yeah.
I mean, there are people who have weird fetishes, and there's nothing they can do about that. But you know what right and wrong. You can't.
Yeah.
You can think kids are hot all you want, just don't touch them. I don't care what you think. Like, your brain is yours. Do what you want. Just don't act on it.
Yeah.
Show some restraint.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. That caught me a little bit off guard. I'm not going to lie. Yeah, and you mentioned there as well, actually, I just want to drag you back to the gladiators quickly, about the blindfolded gladiators. Surely some of them injuries must have been pretty horrific then, because they're swinging almost, well, blindly, obviously, but sort of wild as well. Or what sort of weapons were they using?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the blindfolded gladiators, I believe they had the pretty standard. So the standard for most gladiators was a gladius, right? The word gladiator comes from gladius, which was the standard sword that like a Murmillo or a Thrax would use. There were 2 different types of gladiators, but a lot of them used this it was a short sword, and it didn't have an arm guard, but they had arm protection that were like plates, like segmented plates that went up one arm. They almost looked like an umpire from a baseball game, or a catcher from a baseball game, where they were sort of padded all over. So they actually had a lot of these guys had a lot of armor. So even though they were, it was almost like medieval knights, right? Even though they're swinging these weapons that can do a lot of damage to an unprotected opponent, if you've got enough armor on, you're going to get damaged, but you're not going to get killed. And so it was really the armor that saved a lot of these guys. They would just beat each other into oblivion with these instruments of battle, but a lot of the time they weren't taking fatal blows.
Yeah, when I've said that, and when you were saying about it, I was just imagining them in like the loincloth sort of a deal with a
there
thing
were
on.
some.
To be honest,
there were actually gladiators who fought with two swords, one in each hand, and no protection. There were also gladiators that fought with the cestus, which they wore what was called cesti, which were just wrapped. Their arms were wrapped with they had spikes across their knuckles, and their arms were wrapped with I guess leather strips. So both of their arms would be wrapped. It was almost like boxing gloves with spikes on them, and they would just beat the crap out of each other. So those kind of, those were bloodier bouts. There were definitely, if you were the guys with just the two swords, or if the cesti, like those bouts were going to be bloody. Still usually not to the death, but it would take you a long time to recover, and you might never fight as a gladiator again. But yeah, the guys that we think of in just the loincloth, fighting a lion and two other guys, and hacking each other's heads off, it just wasn't how it happened. These were regulated matches with they had rules too. They literally had like certain things that were acceptable and certain things that weren't. So it was a lot more of a sport than we think it was when we look back.
Yeah, obviously I didn't know anything about that. The only thing I've seen on sort of Gladiator, I've not ever sort of done any learning, like any education on it, is from obviously the film Gladiator, and then the TV series.
There was Spartacus.
Spartacus. Like that for me, it's a wicked TV series. Obviously,
I haven't watched it.
It's complete lies from what you've just told me.
It is, in fact. One of the things that I didn't know before I looked into this, Spartacus never fought in the Colosseum. We always think of Spartacus as, and it's very possible that Spartacus never fought as a gladiator. He was Thracian who was enslaved, and he was trained at Eleusis, which was one of the gladiatorial schools, and he led an uprising there, or at least participated in one, and then kind of took over as the leader along with two other guys. But he was never a famous gladiator. He lived 100 years before the Colosseum was ever built, and it looks like there's no record of him ever having actually fought as a gladiator. He was mostly just training as one, and then led this rebellion. So yeah, a lot of the stuff that we believe, and obviously Gladiator the movie, it wasn't based on a real gladiator. There was no Maximus. And a lot of the things that you see in there are just nonsense. There was a Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, and his son Commodus. Commodus did not kill his father. They actually ruled together for many years. So yeah, one of the things I've learned from doing this podcast is just don't trust Hollywood at all.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, I knew that already, but yeah. So what other your astrology? What have you learnt there? What's the sort of standout thing that you've learnt in astrology?
Oh my God. I don't know where to even get into it with astrology. It's really interesting. It's a lot more intricate than I thought. And I think what I learned about it is I had a lot of disdain for astrology. I'm a very logical person. And so for me, it's pretty ridiculous to think that the stars and the position of the planets are somehow affecting me based on the time I was pulled out of my mother's womb, especially considering like you're not even born at a natural time. Like they induce labor a lot of times. They'll do a cesarean section. So a doctor is deciding when you're born a lot of the time. And yet down to the minute, they have these star charts, these natal charts that they tell you your personality and your future and how you are as a person. And they're basing that on the time that you were taken out of your parent. And it just, the idea that like stars millions of miles away had some effect on who I am and I would be a different person if I was taken out a few minutes later based on the stars, it's crazy. It's nonsensical. And so it's really hard for me to do an episode where I'm not rolling my eyes the entire time. So I had to make an effort to try to take it more seriously and just look at it from the perspective of someone who maybe is more open to that idea. And it was really interesting. I mean, there is a lot that goes into it once you get into your rising sign. You're the sign that you think you are, right? So I'm a Scorpio. That's my sun sign, which means that's the sign that was in the sky. Ideally, the idea is that it was in the sky behind the sun during my birth. And then there's a moon sign, right? And then there's a rising sign, which is your personality. And the moon sign is your inner self. And then there are houses. So each house has something to do with a different aspect of your life. So finances and friendship and sex. These are all in, and you can have the Mercury in your eighth house, right? Which would mean that, and Mercury stands for something. So I think, for instance, I have Saturn in my eighth house, which is karma, and the eighth house is sex. So karma and sex are somehow related for me. It's all very, very intricate. And I had no idea how much time and effort people put into these things. To me, it just seemed like a hobby or something silly that people do. But they these charts are really elaborate and they take a lot of time. And so I have respect for the people that do it, because even though it's not a science, they have to put science level, discipline into this, what I consider a hobby. So I guess that's what I learned, is that like it's still incredibly nonsensical and none of it makes sense. And in fact, we spent a lot of time talking about the debunking of it. NASA has put out blogs on how it doesn't. You're not even actually the sign you think you are, based on the amount of time that is. Anyway, there's a lot. I'm not going to go. Like I said, this is a can of worms that we could go into. But I guess I have a little more respect for the people that do it, because boy, they are really doing their homework on this stuff.
Yeah, big time. It does sound a lot of work, and I would say less than a minute into giving me the opening, I was like, this is horseshit.
Yeah.
There is no way that it goes down to the minute and stuff, because I know people that were definitely weren't born at the same time, but they're almost identical. And I've met them on completely different occasions. There's a lad that I was ex-military, and there was a lad I was in the RAF with, and one of his mates, he lives up north, he lives miles away from it, and oddly enough, they're both called the same name. It's my little brother and his mate, both called Matthew, and everything about them, their mannerisms, how they are, like just everything that I saw of him during that stag do, I was like, he's absolute spit at my little brother. They don't look alike at all, but personality wise, absolutely exactly the same.
Yeah.
And I could see so many similarities, and I was like, that's mental that I only know you through a mate, and you live hundreds and hundreds of miles away, but you are exactly the same, you pair.
Well, I know people who were born at the same time. Like, I know two twins, right? And they were born a couple minutes apart, and they're totally different. And, the idea, so one thing we found out is that every minute there's about 250 births on average worldwide, right? So every minute you've got 250 people coming out. And the idea that because they're born at the same time, they're all going to have the same characteristics is just bonkers. Like, Ted Bundy or Charles Manson, they were born at the same time as 250 other people. Jeffrey Dahmer was born at the same time as 250 other people, but those 250 other people didn't go eat people. Like, they're different. And so it's just crazy to me that we would even think that just because you're born at a certain time, you have to have certain characteristics, even if you're genetically completely separate, right? Like, your genetics determine a good portion of your personality and your physical characteristics and all of that. And, the stars and planets, where they're sitting at the time you're born, can't influence your DNA. It's just, there's no possible scientific explanation that makes sense with astrology. And yet it turns out, between 50% and 30%, this is in America, of Americans actually believe in astrology, believe that it has some type of scientific validity. And, when you're talking to a third to half the nation believing that something that is basically occult, it's basically mysticism, it's like witchcraft. That's a little alarming to me. That just shows that people are maybe a little more gullible than we think they are.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more. Well, Shane, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. That is sadly it for this week's episode, everyone. But wait and tune in next week for part 2. Thank you very much for coming on, Shane. And say, I suppose, bye for now, and then hi in part 2.
All right. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening, everybody.